Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our webinar today on engaging with the most relevant KOLs for life sciences companies. We're very excited to bring this presentation to you as we are coming with a really unique perspective. I have my colleague Grace on the line, who is going to present the medical perspective for engaging with KOLs. And then, of course, we can't forget about the very robust global requirements when it comes to laws and regulations and adhering to those when you are engaging with KOLs for consulting and speaker program activities. In terms of our introduction, if we go to the next slide, my name is Samantha Sutherland. I'm a director with our Compliance and Ethics Solutions team. I have over 12 years of experience providing various compliance and ethics related support to life sciences companies and have really been involved in anything that goes into designing, implementing, and operationalizing a global healthcare compliance program, including acting as an interim chief compliance officer. So I will be bringing that perspective to the topic areas today. And on the line with me, I have my colleague, Grace Macalino. Grace, would you like to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Macalino. I'm a director in our life sciences practice as well. I head up the Medical Affairs and Scientific Strategy Solutions group. The work I do, I'm an epidemiologist by training, really representing the medical or scientific perspective as it relates to KOL engagement. So super excited to be here, and thanks for joining us. So our learning objectives today really span the spectrum from soup to nuts, understanding what is a KOL and when to leverage them. We're also going to go into discovering and planning for a KOL strategy process across your organization, as well as knowing how to better leverage KOL profiling and then identifying data and then actually what's not on the slide, but going into what tiering and all of that looks like. Super excited. Next slide. So we figured we'd start from the very beginning. People hear this phrase, what is a key opinion leader or a KOL? Anyway, right? And the truth is it could mean many different things, right? A KOL is an expert that represents a perspective of a particular population, right? Sometimes that population of interest might be a healthcare provider. It might be a scientist or a thought leader in a field. It could also be a patient, and really understanding what are their unique needs. And more life sciences organizations are being asked to make sure that we remain focused on patient perspectives and be patient-centric. So accessing KOLs is a neat way to get us access into what's important to the populations we're looking to impact.
And I would just say, Grace, jumping in, it's really important that we're defining this up front, because the definition is very essential to compliance and legal perspective here, because you cannot appropriately understand the risks of engaging with an individual with a KOL unless you understand, who that KOL is, what their perspective is, what activity they're being engaged for. So I think it's very appropriate that we are defining this up front before we kind of get into all the good detailed information.
No, 100%. And then exactly to that point, and the definition of what a KOL is or who they are can really change depending on the kind of information we're looking to gather from them, right? So that's awesome. Next slide. So as you can see on this slide, there are lots and lots of functions within a life sciences organization that really benefit from KOL input. So if you can imagine, KOL input really represents, what's most important to the populations life sciences organizations are trying to impact, with the ultimate goal of improving patient outcomes. Anything from market access folks and payer, health economics and outcomes research, R&D earlier in the process, medical affairs, chief medical officer might want input, as well as folks in commercial teams. And as Sam mentioned, right, it really does. No, that's okay. You can go to the next. As Sam mentioned, it really does make a difference who you're wanting to engage and understanding the compliance risks that may be involved. And we'll definitely talk about that throughout our presentation here as well. So on this slide, we're really focusing first on, what are the engagement opportunities represented by the different boxes and KOL input needs. And these are definitely just meant to be examples. And on this slide, we're focusing on primarily what are medical needs. So from a data safety and monitoring board or DSMB, it could be, understanding study results from a clinical perspective, making sure that your study design components are valid as well as make sense for the patient population you're looking to engage. And I won't review each and every one of these, but we're just giving you ideas in terms of all the ways that key opinion leaders can really help the science or the work that's being done inside of life sciences company be robust, rigorous, as well as most relevant to the populations, right? I'll move to medical strategy, where you can get insights into current disease state and really understanding it, like what are some of the changes that are on the horizon, things to pay attention to think about. What is the patient journey currently, and are there treatment challenges? Are there issues of adherence? Are there different populations that might not be being accessed or reached? Sam, right? I know you've seen and heard some of these things as well, right?
Yep, absolutely. And just doubling back to the polling results. So what's very interesting is 32% of individuals are involved with KOL engagement. 47% of the audience here is not. So I'm curious if maybe they're joining because they're about to start being involved, or maybe about to start that annual KOL planning exercise and just want to get more information. So very, very interesting polling results here.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And please feel free if you have questions, if you're not currently, and it's literally you're at the very beginning or you've never done it before. If there's a question that you feel either comes up for you or that we haven't covered yet, please feel free to throw that in the chat for sure. Next slide. So this is now from a commercial perspective. So your non-medical functions within a life sciences organization, right? Promotional speaker programs might be a way to get KOL input, market research, a broader commercial strategy, or, a specific ad boards, right? And, input on promotional messaging and or content in terms of what types of educational opportunities would be helpful for healthcare providers or specifically for patients on product specific information, right? Sam, if you notice, right, in our examples here, from the commercial standpoint, it is definitely very product specific. It's called out very specifically, right? Again, from a risk standpoint, kind of like the perspective we're looking for from KOLs to give input on. As you notice, definitely distinct and different from the information, similar, but different from what medical is asking for, don't you think?
Yeah, important distinction, Grace. So, obviously from the compliance and legal standpoint, generally, commercial engagements with KOLs are a little bit higher risk. Obviously with medical, there is that risk there that you still have to go through, the business needs assessment form, the approval by compliance and or legal, so that those controls should still be in place. But with commercial, it is scrutinized much more. And you have to be really careful with getting, all of the materials, even as an example, an advisory board, if you are having a specific topic area, the guidance document that you're going to have to lead that meeting, all of these materials should be reviewed and approved by your promotional review committee. And it's very important that those steps are taken and from a compliance legal perspective to ensure that, you're not asking off-label questions. You're not promoting products off-label. You're not promoting products that don't have, full approval by whatever agency in that country, like the FDA. So, lots and lots of compliance and legal considerations in regards to commercial KOL engagements. That's for sure.
No, that's a really great point. And we don't necessarily specifically call this out on our slides, but I think it really is important. So we bring up the KOL definition can change, but it's also important to remember that KOL, it's a two-way street, right? KOLs both are providing information to life sciences organizations, but they too are users of information as well, right? So where and how the information they're learning about the company or a product or a brand might potentially be influencing them. Sam, you really speak to where and how that sort of higher risk, where do you put in controls to make sure that, everything's covered. It is so very valuable.
Yeah. And then the last thing I'll mention is the monitoring. So, any commercial company doing these types of interactions is going to have some kind of auditing and monitoring program that's managed by their compliance department, where they'll be monitoring, a handful of advisory board activities, market research activities, speaker programs, since these opportunities for engagement are higher risk. So something to keep in mind as well.
For sure. Next slide. But we did want to pause a little bit here and talk about the beginning of a KOL engagement strategy should really start with some thoughtful planning, right? defining your objectives up front. How do the objectives fit within your broader brand plan and your product pipeline, right? Depending on where that product is in its life cycle, you might want to be asking different kinds of questions. Are there other products that, how does it link with, this particular brand might link to other company initiatives, and where and how can you find alignment there? So again, not thinking about these KOL engagements necessarily in a vacuum, but how it might relate to the other work that's being done already. Then thinking about specifically, what are the expectations that you want from a KOL engagement? But what I think we like to include as well is, what would KOLs expect from you? Sort of in that one-to-one exchange with KOLs, how do they want to feel set up and taken care of in terms of really being set up for getting the right information or giving you the right information, right? What's the appropriate setting to collect this KOL data? We listed a few earlier. Is it in a steering committee? Are they going to be engaged broadly for a long period of time? Or is it an ad board, maybe a little bit more very focused engagement? How do we measure success? It's this idea of key performance indicators or KPIs. How are we going to show or measure whether the information that you were hoping to gather, was gained? Not that you need it to be a specific perspective, but that you really were focused enough to be able to get the information that you wanted from them. And then ultimately, broadly within your company, did you include the right team in terms of the folks that you're thinking about in all these considerations? Sam, anything you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I think it's just important to think, when you start the exercise of KOL engagement strategy, you really have to go at a very high level and look at the company across all functions, across the highest level of the company objectives, to make sure that you are considering really important elements like you mentioned here, Grace. We mentioned the brand plan, your product pipeline. You can't just think about everything in a silo. You need to think about how it's going to impact, or how the information you obtain through these KOL engagements could benefit other areas of the organization. So, really important to set that stage. And then I do have the polling question number 2 results. So very interesting here. I think not surprising. The highest percentage was all of the above. So, having initiating KOL engagement needs from medical, compliance, legal, commercial, research and development as well. The other ones were pretty equal: medical, compliance, legal, and commercial. Research and development being the lowest. So interesting polling results there.
Next slide. I think it does lead nicely, though, to, you can hear, right? If you do have KOL needs really across a broad range of groups within an organization, just the value of having like a strategy oversight team for KOL engagement, right? You want to speak a little bit more to this?
Yeah, so most of the life sciences companies that I'm supporting at this point have a KOL engagement committee. So that committee would have individuals, key stakeholders from all of the functional areas we've discussed. So it's not just your, those functional areas that actually interact directly with KOLs, which are, medical, commercial, research and development, but having your supporting business partners from compliance, from legal, from marketing, from, these other corporate communications, these other areas that may be impacted is really important. From a risk perspective, I will say that, usually there's no field sales individuals, right, that sit on this team. So not even at the area sales director level. So keep in mind, when I say, commercial, I'm meaning, the lead of commercial, or those individuals that are in leadership positions that fall right under the kind of lead chief commercial officer, as well as marketing. So, no one, it's always at that senior leadership level, just from a risk perspective, that, something is discussed internally that you wouldn't want to find its way to the field and then maybe be accidentally discussed with a KOL or something like that. So very important to have this cross-functional committee team established to make sure that you are approaching these engagements with the right strategy to achieve your overall business objectives.
And I did want to just bring up this sort of KOL management system or platform. I think, having just been at a couple of conferences where, with the influx of tech and opportunities to manage things, more efficiently, right? I think especially given how challenging and kind of all over the place this process could potentially look, really just the value of having some type of platform or system that can actually really support the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next slide. So we really definitely talk about the value of bringing consistency across the organization. You heard, again, lots and lots of different needs, but, everything from, limited pool of KOLs you're reaching out to in terms of not having multiple people from your organization reaching out to the same KOLs to, sometimes some companies have, caps for how much you can pay certain KOLs, and just you hate to have a very important medical need come to the, realization halfway through the year, like, oh my goodness, I can no longer access that KOL because, they've already reached that cap, right? So just the value of having that consistency across the organization, or just a board or a way to really sort of keep track of, all the KOL engagements that are going on across an organization. Don't you think, Sam?
Yeah, Grace, I'm so glad you mentioned the cap. So just for everyone's benefit, there is no law or regulation that specifically stipulates a cap in the US or globally. However, most clients I see, at least in the US, have a cap per HCP on an annual basis that's around 100,000. Sometimes they'll have an additional cap separate from that for speaker programs specifically. And that might be, a little lower, like usually between like 30 to 50,000. But I think your point is absolutely relevant, because I have had clients in the past for sure, the medical team goes to use a KOL or commercial vice versa, and they realize, oh my gosh, this KOL has actually already reached the cap for our organization. I had no idea, because we haven't been coordinating well, across functional teams. So really important, especially when obviously each KOL is unique. And so, part of our webinar today we're speaking on is how to utilize KOLs for the best activity possible. So very important to coordinate and have that consistency across the organization.
For sure.
Perfect. So when we talk about annual KOL planning and selection, there's a lot of things to consider here. So looking at, step one, when you go through the planning process, is establishing your selection criteria and getting, approval and formalizing that is going to also involve compliance. And your selection criteria is going to differ depending on the activity. So for example, selection criteria for speaker programs might incorporate, criteria that is getting at them having experience speaking at independent medical congresses, so that you can kind of confirm that they have that engaging speaker presence that's needed for a speaker program, as an example. You might also look at, that obviously they need to have experience with your product if they're going to be providing input on the product. I know that sounds very common sense level 101, but that is typical selection criteria that I see if it's a product related consulting engagement. Also, alternatively, experience with the disease state or the therapeutic area, if they're providing just general, treatment journey input or something like that. So making sure that you have that established selection criteria that's been reviewed and approved by your compliance legal colleagues is important. Also looking at KOL profiling. So, you want to get a sense for who this individual is and how best to use them at your organization and for which activities. And that's all going to go into KOL profiling and collecting data on those types of information. And as Grace mentioned before, there's lots of companies that have very robust KOL profiling databases that are going to have one, universal place where you can access all this information for a particular KOL. The information that we usually see here is clinical trials, publication information, including, setting some kind of impact factor for the journals in which those publications are made. So usually I see an impact factor of 4 or above, just generally speaking. Also looking at speaking engagements. So as I mentioned before, you know, these types of KOL profiling databases will have information related to independent medical congresses that an individual has spoken at, and very granular, even to the space where you know, they'll have information on whether it was a poster presentation, a session presentation, what the topic area is, so that you can kind of understand, you know, the level of information that this KOL may have to provide to you for a specific topic area. Also looking at their employment, and that includes academic appointments and institutional affiliations. There's much more to, you know, now that social media is kind of, you know, this new thing that is in our lives every day, all day, that's also incorporated. So, you know, what social media presence they have, their social media network, I've seen those kind of indicators in these KOL profiling databases as well. Curious, Grace, if there's any additional information that you've seen, you know, aside from what I've already referenced.
Not different, but I do think the social media piece is very interesting, right? I know that you and I have chatted about in the past. I think, you know, historically, people are very used to understanding the idea of someone who's published a bunch of papers or as a big speaker, you know, at lots of congresses. But this idea of, you know, social influence or being an influencer, or, you know, how many likes do they have, or people that they, right, is such a new, interesting thing that I think really has this idea of KOL, you know, profiling, segmentation, selection, just be constantly evolving, right? Just really having to pay attention to how are we thinking about, you know, someone who might not, again, might not be being published or have a lot of speaking engagements from in that traditional world, but has huge influence, you know, on the internet or something like that, right? And how do we start to quantify what that sphere of influence is, right?
Yep. Yep.
I,
And the last thing too, I left out was citation. So this, I like this one because it's very relevant. Because if someone's publishing a lot, that's great. But how do you measure sort of the impact of their publishment or publishing or publication? And so I actually do see citation counts being utilized to measure kind of the impact there, which I think is a really great way of getting at that.
100%. So I did have the responses from that third question, right? So there were about 42 that said none of the above, not applicable. So interesting. Maybe there aren't sort of this organizing body. It's unclear how it breaks down by not applicable or none of the above. But all of the above, about 28% of folks said that, you know, what functional areas sort of are involved with planning and on an annual basis. 13% commercial, 15% medical, and then 3% market access. So also very interesting and not consistent, which is fine, right? We know that different organizations kind of organize differently, but, you know, as you said, the clients that have those sort of organizing bodies and committees really tend to be that much more efficient because you have the right people involved and included from the planning from the jump.
Yep. Yep. And I think these results don't surprise me. So I think, you know, if for the not applicable or none of the above, you guys are probably in that, I would guess, like emerging state, you know, probably in your maturity. So that's not surprising. And then of course, the second highest being the all of the above. So, you know, if you do have that committee in place, then it is including, you know, relevant individuals from all the functional areas, which is great.
Exactly. Next slide.
Perfect. So getting into the super fun laws and regulations that govern
and very relevant.
Yeah. So we're speaking about the United States specifically here, guys, but obviously global countries have their own, you know, anti-bribery, anti-corruption laws that speak on payments to KOLs for consulting activities. So just, you know, keep that in mind. Here in the US, we have the anti-kickback statute that is typically referenced in enforcement actions related to HCP or KOL consulting. The AKS makes it a crime to pay, offer, solicit, or receive remuneration directly or indirectly, which is an important distinction there, to induce referrals or services of government business. The False Claims Act is interesting because it actually just amplifies the penalties of the AKS, so that if a company is found to be in violation of the AKS and they have a financial penalty that is that they must pay, the False Claims Act multiplies that financial penalty. So and it's automatically triggered. So if you have a violation of AKS, then you are automatically violating the FCA as well. And then, of course, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act makes it a crime to make corrupt payments to non-U.S. government officials to obtain or retain business. This is really important if you are a U.S. company that's engaging, a global company that has a U.S. headquarters, and you're engaging with ex-U.S. individuals in countries where there's a public healthcare system. Depending on, and you have to look into this at a country by country level, some of the countries actually consider physicians that work within the public healthcare system to be counted as government officials by definition. So it's really important, if you are engaging with KOLs in ex-US countries, you understand which ones, like China, for example, where your physicians might be considered government officials, and then what requirements you need to meet in terms of those engagements. Next slide.
Yeah.
Getting into thought leader status here. So, in terms of tiering, and this is for compliance and legal purposes. So you guys are seeing here the connection, right, between KOL profiling as a medical commercial market access exercise is evaluating KOLs to determine how best to use them and how best to engage with them. Where from the compliance legal perspective, we utilize the same data and information across everything that we discussed in the previous slide for publications, clinical trial activities, independent speaking engagements, employment and academic appointments and institutional affiliations. We look at the same information, but we use it in the way of assigning an expertise level to identify an appropriate payment amount for that specific HCP. In terms of the way that we utilize these high-level categories of expertise, so there is no one way that I see life sciences companies establishing tiering criteria. There is no, unfortunately, the government doesn't give us a great, just clear directive on exactly how we should tier people, the criteria to use them. So each company has differences, right? Nuanced differences company to company. Speaking generally, though, the categories of expertise you're going to see across all life sciences companies that are utilized to establish an expertise level for fair market value payment application are the ones you see here. So you'll see individuals looking at employment. Again, not to sound like a broken record, but that includes academic and institutional affiliations. And then not only affiliations, but also what's the individual's role level within that employment. So are they the chair of their department at this hospital? Are they a for certain non-KOLs for that you might engage with, are they a chief executive officer at a at a payer, or are they a patient advocacy executive that you're engaging with? So it does get to not only what institution are they affiliated with, is it a leading institution in their therapeutic area, but what is their role level at that institution? Okay. Looking at publications. So again, we look at publications that are established and well regarded and that have an impact factor over 4, and the frequency of publishing with a qualifying timeline, usually between 7 and 10 years. So, with your clinical trial activities and with your publication activities, you really want to put a time frame on the kind of count that you are looking at and how frequently they do these activities, because obviously within the life sciences industry, the treatment landscape changes so quickly, and there's so much innovation that you really need to make sure you have someone who's up on the current trends on how things are currently being treated, to give you that most important input and information and insights. Okay. With clinical, Grace.
No, that's okay, Sam. The only thing I was going to add was literally, like, it shouldn't be surprising at all that the qualifications and the criteria that are being used by compliance and legal shouldn't be surprising, or that it's aligned with what medical thinks, right? Because that makes the most sense, right? It shouldn't be this other thing, as opposed to it's exactly the same way that we think about, where and how, you would expect folks to be tiered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's obviously a very similar exercise. I think the one thing that might be different is with tiering for compliance and legal purposes, it's very objective. You know, you want
100%.
to have it black and white criteria, so that you can easily show, hopefully no one ever has a regulatory enforcement agency asking why they tiered someone this way. But if you do, you have that documented and it's very clear, you know, this is our criteria. This is the individual CV document. This is the piece of criteria they met. This is where it is on their CV. And that satisfied the ask from the agency. Where I believe, you know, Grace, and correct me if I'm wrong, is with the medical side, it's more subjective, as it should be, where, you know, you can evaluate this person based on, you know, criteria that's maybe out of like the kind of set criteria you might standard look at, like association involvement or advisory roles, like an FDA advisory panel for example, or a treatment guidelines committee. You know, maybe these pieces of criteria are not standard KOL profiling information, but extremely relevant, and you can like work that in subjectively as you see fit.
Agreed. But it shouldn't be, I guess, I can align to what you're saying, and that it's no surprise, but the idea that there is this opportunity to have it be objective and it could be stand, you know, the light, you know, sort of complete transparency is, you know, is what everyone would want in the first place, for sure.
Yeah. In talking about clinical trials, so just like, you know, employment, not only are you looking for the number of clinical trials this individual has been involved with, but also, you know, you can look at what's the role on the clinical trial. Are they the PI of the entire trial? Are they a site level PI? You know, are they doing clinical trials for government agencies like the NIH? Or the Department of Defense. So there's lots more to consider if you want to, you know, underneath that clinical trial category.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at speaking engagement, so you know what I usually utilize under this area is they have to be, for compliance and legal purposes, independent speaking engagement. So you're looking at speaking engagements at medical society congresses. You are not looking at criteria that includes conferences or speaking engagements for other peer companies of yours that have been in a promotional context. So that's a really, really important distinction for the compliance and legal side. And then associations and journal activities. So is this member, you know, the president of a national, you know, physician association, or some sort of prestigious role like that, where they are, you know, regarded as a national thought leader in their area, and thus they have been, you know, voted into this important position. Depending on the criteria in each of these areas, typically then, you know, again, just like tiering, the government hasn't really given us a nice guidance on fair market value payments. So you may see a little bit of nuance here, but in general, my clients in life sciences companies typically have 3 different expertise levels. So your tier 1 are those top national, international thought leaders. Your tier 2 are going to be your regional thought leaders with significantly above average expertise, but they haven't reached that national, international level yet. And then tier 3 are your average to above average expertise levels. The way that this ties into fair market value, just for the audience today, we'll touch on is, you know, your FMV is going to be typically based on compensation data that is specific to that KOL. So, you know, for example, if you're engaging with a neurologist, it would be compensation data that's specific to neurologists within, you know, whatever geographic region that you're operating within. So for this example, we'll say the United States. With these 3 tier levels, typically the raw compensation data percentiles will correspond to these. So you'll have the 50th compensation percentile to the 75th being equal to your local thought leaders. And the reason the 50th is used as the minimum is important here is, you know, we know that our life sciences companies don't engage with less than average KOLs for these types of consulting engagements. So you really are looking for kind of the top 50%, right, of individuals to provide you this valuable insight and feedback. Tier 2, your regional thought leaders will typically be falling within the 75th to 90th compensation percentiles within their specialty or their field. And then those top top national, international key opinion leaders are going to fall within the 90th to 95th compensation percentiles. It's important to know how tiering links to FMV, right? Because they are absolutely directly linked. And then what's important to note is typically the maximum of tier 1 is going to be around the 95th compensation percentile in my experience. And what that leaves is a little bit of room for exceptions. And this is important. When you're having the 95th be the maximum of your tier 1, then you're going to have a little bit of exceptions. And what we recommend is 5% or less on an annual basis, where you are contracting with those top global experts, Nobel Prize winners, where they are not captured in the raw compensation data that's in the 95th percentile to the 50th. So you will need to likely pay them an amount that's above your tier 1 maximum, and that's okay, as long as you document the exception. There's an exception process form that should be completed explaining what the credentials are of this individual, why they qualify for this exception, and what that exception amount is. So there is room for those small percentage of top global experts to have an FMV rate that's above your tier 1 maximum, if done appropriately, right, guys? If done appropriately, then it is okay.
Hey, Sam, before we move to the next slide, I think, just to tie it back to, KOLs are tapped for different purposes. I think it's really easy to go like, oh, then we want tier 1 for everything then, because they're the best and the brightest, right? Well, maybe not so much, or not necessarily, right? Historically or traditionally, your tier 1 are probably, healthcare providers that aren't seeing a lot of patients any longer, right? So they're, internationally renowned scientists that are, traveling and speaking a lot, but maybe, have a clinic once a month, if they're, still connected to, clinical care. So depending on the kind of insights you're looking for, as far as, treating patient populations, sort of, what are they seeing in the patient populations on a regular basis, that tier 1 HCP might not be the person that's most valuable, depending on the kind of questions you want to answer. So I think just bringing in that point, right, in terms of the who and the what is really dependent on kind of going back to, what's the input that's most valuable for you, depending on the specific need at that time.
Yeah, and just to expand upon that, an interesting trend or pattern, that I usually see, supporting a lot of clients on global tiering and things like that. Usually your speakers bureau might fall, majority of them, into tier 2 and 3, right? Because they're usually local thought leaders or regional thought leaders that have a strong local network or regional network that treat, like you said, Grace, typically maybe they're not doing a lot of publications or clinical trials, but they are treating a lot of patients. They have a lot of experience with your product. So, an interesting thing just to note for the audience is that is definitely a trend or pattern that I see across clients.
For sure.
Yeah. So going to the next slide, just to kind of, round us out here. The tiering process, if those on the phone here have not been involved, are many challenges to it. It actually is much more nuanced and tedious than I think, people appreciate before they get involved with it. So, usually there's many challenges here, right? Mentioning it, just manual tiering. And what I mean by manual tiering is when you are reviewing an individual CV, 35, 40 pages long, looking for really specific pieces of criteria to pull out and then evaluate against your documented, formalized pieces of tiering criteria to provide a concluded tier level or expertise level for a KOL. That process is very costly. It's tedious. It's human error and bias prone by nature. It's also really tough within the established criteria to treat highly specialized or rare disease KOLs and really, have criteria in there to address the nuances of rare disease. KOLs sometimes don't want to provide you with their CV, or it's tough to get them to update it. So if you have, qualifiers like timelines that I was mentioning before, where they have to do a certain number of clinical trials in the last 7 years, if you don't have an updated CV, then they're not going to show, possibly as a tier 1 because that's outdated. also, um, the problem here usually is that I see a lot of higher level individuals, typically in medical, involved with manual tiering, and those are people that are very experienced. They are PhDs, they are MDs. Their time is so much better spent elsewhere than manually tiering and reviewing an individual CV document. So there's a lot of challenges that exist in the standard tiering process as we've seen it. Which begs for some kind of technology or automated tool that can interject consistency, objectivity, efficiency, and standardization into that tiering process.
Yeah, that was the piece I was going to highlight. Sometimes you have the folks in medical literally being not just identification, but doing the tiering. And that's just a lot of work for sure.
Yep. And then, of course, having, compliance or legal review and approve the business needs assessment form and the tier and the FMV rate after the fact. I mean, that's a lot of time and work effort there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to round out, the compliance legal perspective here, mm-hmm. And kind of level set back to those laws and regulations that we showed a few slides ago. Tiering of KOLs and then the of course, accompanying assignment of a FMV rate is, not only important from a business perspective to make sure that you are compensating your KOLs fairly, able to engage the appropriate KOLs for the specific opportunity or engagement that you're looking at, but it's also really important from a compliance and legal perspective. And those laws and regulations that I touched on before do not operate in a vacuum. There is, this is one of the highest risk areas for any life sciences company in the US or globally. And there are active enforcement actions on an ongoing basis that focus on payments to HCPs. So just touching on and large dollar amounts that you guys see here, right? The 2020 Novartis settlement that was $590 million. We had a 2022 Bayer settlement that was $40 million. And then the most recent largest settlement ever of its kind, Biogen, $900 million last year, all related to payments to HCPs and for these types of consulting and speaker program activities. Additionally, different types of activities have had, special fraud alerts from the DOJ, like your speaker program saying, you really shouldn't be providing alcohol, like individuals that have attended a program previously that had the same topic or a similar topic should not be compensated to go to the same program again. There's not only enforcement action, but special fraud alerts and lots of, focus from government officials on these types of activities. So keep that in mind. And then I think we have the polling results here for question number 4. So
you got it. Go ahead.
Yeah, it looks like not having established and documented criteria is number 1, which is absolutely a very high risk. The second one we got here is having non-medical, non-compliance individuals performing the tiering. So I do agree with that. I mean, if you're going to have another individual performing that tiering, then you need to make sure you have some kind of process in place where that is being reviewed by a compliance or legal person at the very least. Anything to add there, Grace?
Well, and then just the fact that, 21 people, 25% said not applicable or none of the above. Again, it might not, I can imagine for new and emerging companies or folks that haven't engaged KOLs yet, or it's a bit sort of sporadic here and there, that this, even understanding whether this risk exists or even going there, it could be really daunting. So just, again, part of why we wanted to put this webinar together was to start kind of demystifying all the components that actually are included within, how to think about a KOL engagement strategy.
Perfect. Next slide.
So we did just want to round it all out to just kind of remember that at the end of the day, the impact of a successful strategic KOL engagement is really, focused back on the patients, right? Without the input of KOLs, whether they be healthcare providers, scientific leaders, or patients, life sciences organizations would really be kind of moving in the dark, not really knowing where and how best to focus the work that they do, trying to get that right drug to the right patient at the right time, trying to respond to unmet needs, and then identify challenges that, maybe we haven't thought of yet, right? With this ever evolving face of healthcare, new technology, ways to really be best responsive to folks just continue to evolve, right? Don't you think, Sam? I just feel like even in the last couple of years alone, just all the changes and the things that are happening, just sort of keeping track and making sure that folks are able to stay relevant, engaging with KOLs now more than ever seems to be so valuable.
Yep, yep. And it is important because it will continue to evolve. I mean, social media, we referenced before in the presentation, has completely changed tiering criteria, KOL profiling criteria, and even, types of engagements with your like social media influencers, utilizing some HCPs as well as patients that we see now. So it's going to continue to evolve, and you have to make sure that you're really strategic about the way you approach it so that you can evolve as well, which is really important.
Well, and I really like what you said earlier about, and at the end of the day, being able to be not just objective, but transparent and speak to, hey, here's what we came up with as to how we rated this social influencer. Or, again, as things start becoming less black and white, but much more, okay, well, how are we quantifying, influence, and where and how they should be tiered, right? So coming up with that objective way to do that, I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we had a couple questions that came through, which is really great. So number one, is research a separate line item cap like speaking engagements for most companies? So great question, and yes. So the $100,000 annual cap that I usually see is for consulting engagements. So that does not include payments related to like clinical or preclinical research. So very important distinction, and glad that came through. And then the second question that we have here, Grace, is what do you find most challenging in the entire KOL engagement process? So interested to see what you think from your medical perspective.
I was going to say, I would imagine sort of the Grace answer is different from the Sam answer for sure. I think that it's really tough in the beginning. I think most challenging is really getting to that true objectivity, like what that means, right? It's really easy, I think, early on for medical or companies to like, oh, I know people, I know all the thought leaders in a field, and everything from, okay, great, now we have to justify why that person on paper in a very objective black and white way should be the right person to engage with, I think is really can be challenging. I think it's also, what do you do after you've tapped, sort of like, I know everyone becomes like, oh, wow, okay, maybe that's just a few people. And once you've sort of tapped, tap that well, kind of like, where do you go from there? And how do you get access to those KOLs that aren't just the obvious ones, if you will? Those, I think, would be sort of from the jump, the first things that come to mind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Early challenges. How about you?
Yeah, from a compliance perspective, I honestly think, and everyone will probably think that I would say the FMV rates and like making sure that, they're appropriate and the KOLs are happy and being compensated fairly. But I actually think it's establishing a robust enough tiering criteria to appropriately establish thought leader status, because thought leaders mean different things, like we said in the beginning, different things to different people. So, you have your community hospital oncologist whose perspective is extremely important to you. And then you have, like you mentioned, Grace, that top like academic scientific researcher who's not really seeing patients anymore. And how do you develop tiering criteria that accounts for these kind of very different individuals that are still kind of considered thought leaders, right, in their field? Like, not every community hospital individual who has a large patient volume, I would not say that person's a tier 3 average thought leader. I think that's a very important thought leader in their field, and they're going to have more experience with your product, more experience with the patient journey, and have all that valuable information for you. So I think creating robust tiering criteria to capture all types of thought leaders is a challenging process.
Yeah, 100%. Now, this is great. Any other questions? Let's see. We have 5 more minutes. Sam Sam and I can talk about this every day, all day. So if you guys have other questions that come to mind, please feel free to reach out to us. We have our contact information available there to you.
Perfect. I think we could wrap it up, Grace, if we don't have any other questions from the group. But please feel free. Again, Grace said our contact information is here. So if you feel like speaking directly and not in a public forum, please reach out to us. We're happy to chat.
Great. And thank you so much for your time today. It's been great. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
All right. Talk to you soon, everyone.
Bye.